The city burned behind her. Sirens screamed through the night, drowning in the echoes of breaking glass and the distant crackle of fire. Jessica Jones stood in the wreckage, her knuckles bloodied, her breath slow and steady despite the chaos. A toppled street lamp cast long shadows over the ruined pavement, and somewhere in the distance, a car alarm wailed, a sharp, rhythmic pulse against the silence stretching between her and the man who had just arrived. Captain America. His silhouette was a monument of ironclad principle, carved against the flickering city lights. The battered shield rested at his side, but his posture was rigid, controlled. He didn't need to speak. His presence alone was a sentence, a quiet judgment passed down from a world that never understood the choices Jessica had to make. "You went too far," he said finally, his voice even but edged with something colder than disappointment. Jessica exhaled, rolling the tension from her shoulders. "You always say that." Her tone was sharp, but there was something else beneath it, something unspoken, woven deep between their words. Not resentment, not defiance. Something older, heavier. Steve took a step forward, and the air between them tightened. The distant fires painted him in streaks of orange and gold, but his eyes remained untouched, blue like an unbroken sky, unwavering, searching. Jessica held his gaze, refusing to be the first to look away. "I did what had to be done. You crossed a line. They deserved it." He didn't answer right away. The silence between them stretched, heavy with things they would never say aloud. The scent of rain clung to the air, mixing with the acrid sting of smoke. Steve ran a hand down his face, a slow, measured motion, as if steadying himself. "I don't want to fight you, Jessica." A dry laugh left her lips, sharp as broken glass. "Then you shouldn't have come." For a moment, neither of them moved. The world around them shrank, the sirens fading into the distance, the city's ruin nothing more than a backdrop to the war brewing in the space between them. Then he stepped closer. Close enough that she could see the way his breath hitched, so subtle, so controlled. Close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from him, the kind of warmth that could melt through the coldest armor. He lifted a hand, slow, deliberate. Not a threat, not a command, a test. Jessica's throat tightened, but she didn't move. His fingers brushed against her wrist, barely a touch, barely a whisper. Yet it burned more than any fire, louder than any explosion. "Come back with me," he murmured, and for the first time, the steel in his voice softened just enough for her to hear what he wasn't saying. Jessica swallowed hard. She could walk away. She should. It would be easier, cleaner. The world didn't need people like her, not in the way it needed people like him. But Steve had always been a contradiction. The soldier who followed orders but broke the rules when it mattered. The man who stood for justice but understood the cost of it. And right now he wasn't looking at her like a mistake. He was looking at her like she mattered. Jessica exhaled, slow and measured, before turning her hand, just slightly, just enough. Her fingertips brushed against his, a fleeting moment, fragile as glass. Then, just as quickly, she pulled away. The night swallowed them both, but the war was far from over. The rain came slow at first, thin, scattered drops sizzling against the smoldering wreckage of the city. Then, like a dam breaking, the sky cracked open, drenching the ruins in a cold, relentless downpour. Jessica Jones didn't move. Neither did Steve. They stood there, motionless, as if waiting for the storm to decide their fate. The weight of the moment pressed between them, thick as the smoke rising from the shattered street. Jessica flexed her bruised fingers, feeling the sting where skin had split against concrete and bone. She'd felt worse. She'd survived worse. But there was something in Steve's gaze that unsettled her. Not anger, not judgment. Something deeper. "Say it," she muttered. Steve blinked, rain running in thin rivulets down his face. "Say what?" "That I was reckless. That I lost control. That I'm a liability." Silence. Then a quiet exhale. "You think that's what I believe?" Jessica scoffed, turning away. "Doesn't matter." She took a step forward, past the broken glass and debris, but Steve caught her wrist, gentle but firm. She froze. The warmth of this touch, even in the freezing rain, sent something sharp through her. Not pain, something else. You can't keep doing this, he said, his voice steady low. Jessica clenched her jaw. Let go, Steve. He didn't. Not right away. His fingers loosened slightly, just enough to allow space, but not enough to let her slip away completely. The storm swirled around them, thunder rumbling deep in the distance, a warning carved into the sky. I know why you did it, he said, but there's a difference between justice and revenge. Jessica stiffened. And which one do you think I'm after? Steve's expression didn't change. He already knew the answer. She swallowed hard, shaking her head. Don't act like you're any different. For a moment, the only sound between them was the rain pounding against the ruins. Steve's grip finally eased, and Jessica took the opportunity to step back, putting distance between them. Maybe I'm not, he admitted, but that doesn't mean I get to decide who deserves to be saved. Jessica laughed, but there was no humor in it. Spare me the lecture, Captain. She turned on her heel, ready to disappear into the night, but his voice stopped her cold. Jessica. Something in his tone, something raw, something almost unspoken, made her hesitate. She didn't turn around, couldn't. The rain blurred the edges of the world, made everything softer, quieter, but she still felt him there, like a force, like gravity, like something she didn't know how to escape. You don't have to do this alone, he said, softer this time. Jessica closed her eyes, just for a second. The past had taught her that people like him didn't stay, that they couldn't. So why did it feel like he wasn't leaving? A long pause. Then, barely above a whisper, so quiet she almost thought she imagined it. I'll be here when you're ready. Jessica's breath caught. She didn't answer. She just walked away, fading into the storm, hoping the rain would wash away the fire still burning inside her. The city had secrets. They whispered through dark alleys, blood through the cracks in broken pavement, hid beneath the neon glow of flickering streetlights. Jessica Jones knew them well, had spent years listening, hunting, surviving. Tonight was no different. The rain had passed, but the air remained thick, damp with the scent of smoke and asphalt. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed, cutting through the silence like a blade. Jessica kept moving, her steps sharp, purposeful. She wasn't running. She never ran. But she knew who was following her. The familiar weight of his presence lingered behind her, steady as a heartbeat. She didn't need to turn around to know he was there, to feel the careful distance he kept, like a shadow that refused to fade. She reached a dead-end alley and stopped. The walls on either side were crumbling brick, the faint hum of a city that never slept vibrating beneath her feet. Jessica sighed. You always this bad at giving people space. A pause. Then, you left without an answer. His voice was calm, controlled, but there was something else beneath it, a quiet insistence, a weight that pressed against the air between them. Jessica smirked, folding her arms. Didn't realize I owed you one. Footsteps, slow, measured. Then he was there, just beyond the shadows. Captain America, an icon, a soldier, a symbol that stood taller than the buildings around them. But now, in this moment, he was just a man, one who refused to walk away. Steve exhaled, watching her carefully. You know why I'm here. Jessica tilted her head. Because you think you can fix me. His gaze didn't waver. Because I know you don't need fixing. Something sharp twisted inside her, a feeling she didn't have the patience to name. She scoffed. Then why are you wasting your time? Steve took another step forward, closing the space between them, not enough to be threatening, just enough to be undeniable. Jessica stayed rooted where she was. She wouldn't back down. Not from him. Not from this. You think I don't know what it's like? He asked, voice steady, to carry a weight no one else understands. Jessica clenched her jaw. Steve continued, I've made choices I can't take back. Watched people I care about slip away because I thought keeping my distance would keep them safe. His blue eyes locked onto hers, unshaken. It doesn't. The alley felt smaller now, the world narrowing to the space between them. Jessica hated how easily he got under her skin. How he saw the things she kept buried beneath sarcasm and broken glass. She swallowed. I don't need saving, Steve. His lips quirked, just slightly. I never said you did. A flicker of something passed between them. A silent war fought in glances in the space between words. The city hummed around them, but neither of them moved. Jessica should have walked away. Instead, she held her ground. And for the first time in a long time, she wasn't sure which one of them would break first. The alley hummed with tension, the air between them electric, thick with things neither of them dared to say. Jessica could feel the weight of Steve's presence pressing into the silence, steady as the heartbeat she refused to acknowledge. She should have walked away. Should have left him standing there in the shadows, swallowed by the neon glow of the city that didn't care for ghosts like them. But she didn't. Because some battles weren't fought with fists. Some wars had no clear winner. And tonight, she wasn't sure if she was the soldier or the battlefield. Steve's voice was quiet when he finally spoke. "You're not alone in this." Jessica let out a breath, sharp, uneven. "Don't start." "I'm serious." He stepped forward, careful but unrelenting, his eyes searching hers. "You think I don't know what it's like to carry something too heavy to put down?" Jessica clenched her jaw, fingers curling at her sides. "And what, you think you can carry it for me?" His gaze didn't waver. "No, but I can stand beside you." The words hit harder than she expected, slipping past her armor before she could stop them. Jessica looked away, eyes flickering to the distant skyline, the city stretching endlessly beyond them. The rain had stopped, but the streets still glistened, reflecting the glow of streetlights like fractured glass. She could still hear the echo of her own choices in the quiet. She could still taste the bitterness of every fight she had fought alone. And yet, here he was. Not demanding, not pleading. Just there. Jessica swallowed hard, forcing a smirk. "You really don't know when to quit, do you?" Steve let out a quiet chuckle, but there was no humor in it, just something softer, something tired. "Not when it comes to the things that matter." The air between them shifted, something fragile threading its way through the cracks of their unspoken war. Jessica felt it in the way his stance softened, in the way the sharp edge of his voice smoothed into something quieter, steadier. She felt it in the way her own walls threatened to buckle, in the way her pulse betrayed her with every second she didn't turn and walk away. A mistake. It had to be. She had spent too long convincing herself that people like him didn't belong in the same world as people like her. That heroes like Steve Rogers didn't stand beside people who knew what it meant to cross the line. But then he moved. Just slightly. Just enough that, for the briefest of moments, she could feel the warmth of him, solid, unwavering, as if the very foundation of who he was refused to be shaken. Jessica sucked in a breath. This wasn't a battlefield, but it sure as hell felt like one. Steve's voice was softer now, barely a whisper against the city's hum. "You don't have to do this alone, Jessica." The words settled deep, sinking past scars she never let heal. She closed her eyes, just for a second. Just long enough to let herself believe him. Then, before the moment could break her, she turned and walked away. Because some wars weren't won in a single night. Some battles needed time. And she wasn't ready to surrender just yet. The city never truly slept. Even in the dead of night, life pulsed through its veins, sirens wailing, streetlights flickering, shadows shifting where they shouldn't. Jessica Jones moved through it like a ghost, her footsteps silent, her breath steady. But something was wrong. She could feel it. A presence. A weight pressing against the air, thick with something unseen. It wasn't Steve, not this time. This was something else, something dangerous. Jessica slowed her pace, her instincts sharpening. The alley she stepped into was empty, the pavement slick from the earlier rain, the distant hum of the city muffled like the world was holding its breath. Then, a sound. A whisper of movement barely there. Jessica pivoted just as a shadow lunged from the darkness. She reacted on instinct. Her fist connected with something solid, a chest, armored. The impact sent a shudder through her arm, but it wasn't enough to stop him. Whoever he was fast, strong. Jessica barely had time to register the second attack before she was blocking, twisting, forcing her weight into a counterstrike. But her attacker moved like liquid shadow, slipping through the space between them, striking with a precision that sent her skidding back against the damp pavement. Not a thug, not some low-level enforcer. This was something else. Jessica wiped rain and blood from her lip, eyes narrowing. You got 3 seconds to tell me who you are before I start breaking bones. A low chuckle echoed from the darkness. Then, a voice, smooth, calculated. Jessica Jones, I was hoping you'd put up a fight. Jessica's muscles tensed, not because of the words, but because of the familiarity in the tone. She knew that voice. Before she could react, he stepped into the dim glow of a street lamp, his face half shrouded in shadow. A ghost from a past she had buried. Jessica's breath hitched. You? He smiled, slow, deliberate. It's been a long time. Jessica's fingers curled into fists, her pulse hammering against her ribs. Not long enough. Then the air shifted again. Footsteps, approaching fast. Jessica turned just as Steve Rogers emerged from the far end of the alley, his shield glinting under the flickering light, his eyes scanning the situation with razor-sharp precision. His presence was immediate, unshakable, a force as undeniable as the storm still lingering in the sky. His gaze locked onto the man before her. Who is he? Steve asked, his voice a quiet demand. Jessica swallowed hard, the ghosts of old wounds pressing against her ribs. She didn't answer right away, because some names weren't meant to be spoken. Not when they came wrapped in the scent of blood and regret. Not when they carried the weight of a past that refused to stay buried. The man tilted his head, his smirk deepening. Careful, Captain. You're stepping into a war you don't understand. Steve didn't move, didn't blink. Try me. The air between them was a live wire, sparking, waiting to explode. Jessica could feel it, the tension thick enough to drown in. And she knew with certainty that the real fight had only just begun. The alley was a war waiting to happen. Jessica could hear the blood rushing in her ears, the steady pound of her heart against her ribs. Her body knew what came next before her mind did. The man before her, the ghost of an unfinished war, hadn't come to talk, and neither had Steve. The moment stretched, heavy with unspoken history, then a flicker of movement. Jessica barely had time to react before her attacker lunged, faster than he had any right to be. His fist cut through the air like a bullet. She twisted, dodging at the last second, but the force of it sent shockwaves through the space she had just occupied. The distraction, because before she could counter, 2 more figures emerged from the shadows, not alone. Jessica's instincts screamed. She pivoted, kicking one of them hard enough to send him crashing into the alley wall. The other barely flinched, already swinging a bait and crackling with electricity. She ducked, too slow. The weapon grazed her shoulder, sending a violent jolt through her body. She gritted her teeth against the pain, refusing to stumble. And then, Steve moved. The shield was a blur of motion, slamming into one of their attackers with bone-crushing force. The impact sent the man sprawling, but Steve didn't stop. He was already turning, already anticipating the next strike. He fought like a force of nature, precise and unrelenting. Jessica didn't waste time watching. She spun, driving her elbow into her attacker's jaw, following up with a brutal kick to his ribs. He staggered, but didn't fall. Too well trained, too prepared. Jessica exhaled sharply. This wasn't random. This was planned. Another blow came. She blocked, countered, slammed her fist into his throat. This time he crumbled. That left one. Jessica turned just in time to see Steve face to face with him, the one who had spoken her name like a curse wrapped in silk. The smirk on his face hadn't faded. You still hit like a soldier, he said, eyeing Steve as he wiped blood from his mouth. Efficient, predictable. Steve didn't blink. You're gonna tell me who sent you. The man laughed. Oh, Captain, you still think you're the one in control. Jessica tensed. Something was wrong. Before she could move, he reached into his belt and tossed something to the ground. A sharp metallic click. Jessica's stomach dropped. Flashbang. The world exploded into white-hot light. Jessica threw up her arms, staggering back as pain tore through her vision. The ringing in her ears was deafening. She felt movement, heard footsteps. By the time her sight returned, the alley was empty. The attackers were gone. Jessica cursed under her breath, chest heaving. Coward. Steve was already scanning the shadows, fists clenched. They wanted to send a message. Jessica wiped blood from her split lip, exhaling sharply. Yeah? Well, I've got a message for them too. Steve turned to her, his expression unreadable. Jessica. She knew what he was about to say. To be careful, to think before she ran headfirst into the fire. But she didn't want careful. She wanted answers. And this time, she wasn't backing down. The city pulsed with a heartbeat Jessica could no longer ignore. She moved through its veins like a shadow, weaving between neon-lit streets and alleyways that whispered old secrets. The night was alive with danger, the kind that tasted metallic on her tongue, the kind that tightened around her ribs like a slow-building storm. Steve walked beside her, his presence an anchor she refused to acknowledge. He didn't ask where they were going. He didn't have to. Because he knew Jessica. And Jessica never let a fight end unfinished. The air between them was thick with unspoken words, but neither of them gave voice to the weight pressing down on their chests. Not yet. Not when the night still belonged to their enemies. Jessica's eyes flickered to the skyline, locking onto the silhouette of a high-rise that loomed like a sleeping beast against the moonlight. There, she could feel it. The answer to a question she hadn't dared ask. Steve followed her gaze, his jaw tightening. You sure about this? Jessica's lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. Never. Then she moved. The building swallowed them whole, its glass doors sliding open as if welcoming ghosts. Inside, the lobby was sterile, cold marble, security cameras, the hum of technology breathing beneath the surface. Too quiet. Jessica's pulse quickened. They weren't just walking into an enemy's hideout. They were walking into a trap. Steve felt it too. She could see it in the way his shoulders tensed, the way his stance shifted. His instincts were screaming. Jessica didn't stop. Because if someone thought they could scare her off, they were about to learn a hard lesson. The elevator ride was silent, the numbers ticking higher, marking the seconds between them and whatever waited above. Then ding. The doors slid open. Jessica stepped out first, and the moment she did, she knew. They were expected. The lights in the corridor flickered, revealing a figure standing at the far end, draped in the shadows of a floor that had been cleared out for one reason only. The man who had whispered her name in the alley. The ghost she had refused to chase. His voice slithered through the space between them. You never could resist a challenge, could you? Jessica didn't stop moving. Save it. He smiled, slow and knowing. Oh, but I've been waiting for this, Jessica. His gaze flickered to Steve. And you brought the good captain. What a surprise. Steve stepped forward, his presence commanding. Enough. Who are you working for? The man tilted his head, amused. Always so direct. Jessica's patience snapped. If you wanted me here, you got me. So cut the theatrics and tell me why I shouldn't break your damn jaw. His expression darkened. Then, movement. Not from him. From the shadows behind them. Jessica turned, barely catching a glimpse before the first shot rang out. Steve moved before she did, shield up, deflecting the bullet before it could find its mark. The force of it sent vibrations through the floor. Then the whole room erupted into chaos. More figures emerged, slipping from hidden doors, from walls that weren't walls at all. Trained, armed, ready. Jessica didn't wait. She spun, driving her fist into the nearest attacker, feeling the sickening crunch of bone. Steve was already beside her, the shield a blur of motion as he knocked 1, 2, 3 enemies back. They were outnumbered. Didn't matter. Jessica fought like she always had, with everything. But even as she struck, even as she tore through the ambush, she knew one thing with certainty. This wasn't about the fight. It was about what came next, and whatever game they had just walked into. She wasn't sure they could win. The fight was brutal, unforgiving. Jessica moved through the chaos like a storm, her fists landing with the force of a battering ram. One enemy crumpled, another staggered, but they kept coming, more trained, more prepared. Steve fought beside her, his shield a force of destruction, every impact sending bodies flying. But even as they carved their way through the ambush, Jessica felt it. Something was wrong. This wasn't a battle. It was a distraction. She caught the shift too late. A blur of motion. A silent figure slipping through the chaos, heading towards Steve's blind spot. Jessica's breath hitched. Stevie. But the warning came an instant too late. A blade, sharp, glinting in the low light, sliced through the space between them, aimed straight for his ribs. Steve turned just in time, his shield barely deflecting the fatal strike. But the moment of hesitation cost him. The attacker twisted, using the momentum to land a vicious kick to Steve's chest. The impact sent him crashing back against the wall, his shield clattering to the floor. Jessica lunged, rage igniting in her veins, but something else stopped her. A voice. Cold, steady, and painfully familiar. Stand down, Jessica. The words turned her blood to ice. Her breath caught as she turned, really turned, toward the man who had lured them here. The man who had whispered her name in the alley, who had vanished into the night just to lead her into this trap. His face was unreadable, but his eyes, they told her everything. He had never planned to kill them. He had planned to break them. And then, in the silence that followed the last fallen soldier, he spoke the words that shattered everything. I never stopped watching you. Jessica's world tilted. Steve, still catching his breath, pushed himself upright. His gaze flickered between them, his battle instincts sensing something deeper beneath the surface of this war. Jessica swallowed hard, her mind racing. You do I come. A slow, almost regretful nod. Steve's voice was sharp. Who are you working for? The man didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his jacket. Jessica tensed, but he only pulled out a small device. A trigger. Jessica's stomach dropped. No, she warned, stepping forward, fists clenched. He smiled, but it wasn't victory. It was something closer to sorrow. This was never about you, Jessica. Then he pressed the button. The entire floor shook. The windows exploded inward. Fire erupted along the walls. Somewhere beneath them, the foundation began to give. Steve grabbed Jessica's arm. Move. But Jessica's eyes were still locked on him. The man who had led her into this nightmare. The man she had trusted once. And in that moment, asterisk asterisk before the floor collapsed beneath them, asterisk asterisk she understood. This betrayal had been written long before tonight, and it was only the beginning.